The ship has no name. It has no flag. There is no record. And there you are on deck, your hands cold, looking out over one of the most heavily guarded stretches of water on the planet. 21 kilometers. On the left, Iran. On the right, the United Arab Emirates. Above you, an American drone that you can't see but you know is there, because it's always there. The captain approaches silently. He stands beside her for a few seconds without saying anything. Then he points towards the northern horizon. There are lights there, warship lights. Destroyer, he says in heavily accented English. Routine patrol, or not. You don't answer. In the basement beneath your feet, there are $90 million worth of crude oil. No document authorizes that cargo. No government recognizes that vessel. And if that destroyer changes direction, if those lights start to grow larger, the explanation you prepared lasts exactly 40 seconds before it falls apart. You are not a career criminal. You are a man who knew ships, knew routes, and one day you received a proposal that seemed too absurd to be real. Over the next 4 years, you will be operating within one of the most sophisticated smuggling networks in the world. You'll learn how to disappear into the middle of the ocean. You'll learn how to buy the silence of people you thought were priceless. And you'll discover that the greatest danger was never the American Navy. It was the moment when you stopped counting money and started counting the days. This is his life. Smuggling oil through the Strait of Hormuz. You had spent the last 12 years in the maritime logistics sector, not as a captain, as the guy who solves problems. When a shipment got stuck in Dubai customs, they called you. When a route needed to be renegotiated in the middle of a political storm, they called you. When paperwork needed to be redone in 48 hours without anyone asking questions, they called you. You were good, very good. And he was, exhausted from earning so little for all he knew. The offer came through an intermediary you vaguely knew, a Greek man named Nikos, who moved between the legal and illegal markets with the ease of someone who never saw a difference between the two. You met at a restaurant in Dubai Marina. Nikos ate slowly, spoke little, and spent most of his time observing the surrounding tables. Not out of paranoia, you realized. Out of habit. He was the type of man who mapped out exits before sitting down. He didn't explain much in that first conversation. He simply said that there was a group moving Iranian oil outside of official channels, that they needed someone who understood real logistics, someone who could plan routes, coordinate stops, create documentation that would withstand a superficial inspection. They paid in dollars. Transfers were split into smaller amounts. Nothing was traceable. You asked how much. He said a number. You asked him to repeat it. When he repeated it, something changed. In the room around you, the noise from the restaurant faded. Your own breathing became a little more conscious, and you understood that the conversation had changed in nature. The question was no longer whether you would accept. The question was how long it would take him to convince himself that he had a good reason to accept. It took 4 days. In the 5th one, you called Nikos. What you didn't know yet, what would take months to understand, was that someone was already monitoring Nikos's communications, and that your number had just entered a tracking system you never knew existed. The operation was more organized than you expected. There was structure, there was hierarchy, there were procedures. The oil was being shipped from clandestine terminals off the Iranian coast, small facilities in coves where the GPS signal conveniently floats, far from commercial satellites. It was loaded onto ships with no visible identification. And then came the part that depended on you. Their job was to create what they called a clean window. You arrived at the ship at 4 in the afternoon in a small port north of Fujairah. You boarded without ceremony. The captain, a middle-aged man whose full name you never learned, only Mehdi, greeted you on deck with a curt handshake and led you straight to the navigation room. The AIS system screen was lit. The ship existed on that screen. It had coordinates. It had a recorded route. On paper, it had a cargo of industrial machinery destined for Karachi. Mehdi looked at you. You looked at the screen. And then he did what he had planned. He typed in the sequence of commands that would alter the transmitted route, replace the identification number with a code linked to a shell company registered in the Marshall Islands, and virtually move the ship to a different position than the real one. A ghost ship, sailing parallel to the real ship, creating tracking noise. There was a different kind of silence in the room when you finished. The crew, that was nearby, 3 men, said nothing. They just watched. You realized at that moment that you had crossed paths with something, not the strait yet, another thing. The first route required 18 days of preparation. The intersection itself, 4 hours. From a rented apartment in Sharjah, using a laptop and an encrypted connection, you monitored the ship's real position on a parallel system while the official system showed a fictitious ship sailing peacefully in another direction. The raw hours passed slowly. You weren't able to eat anything during the crossing. When the message arrived, 2 words, destination reached, you stared at the screen for a long moment, alone in the apartment, with the sound of the air conditioner being the only thing in the world. 92,000 barrels of crude oil had crossed one of the most heavily monitored checkpoints on the planet. The payment arrived 2 days later. You went to a bank in Dubai, withdrew some cash, and sat in a cafe, looking at the money in your bag as if it belonged to someone else. It belonged to someone else, but it was his too. Nico showed up that afternoon with a bottle of something expensive and a smile that said he knew exactly what was going on inside his head. The first time is like that for everyone, he said. Does it get easier? He considered the question with unusual honesty. It's different, he said. I'm not sure it'll be easier. You drank it anyway. What you didn't know yet was that in an office in Bahrain, an analyst from the U.S. Fifth Fleet had noticed an AIS anomaly that week. Small, probably nothing. He opened a file and typed a note. At that moment, with the first payment in your pocket and the first delivery completed, would you have left, or would you have stayed? Answer in the comments. Most people say they would have left. Few actually would. 2 months after the first operation, you understood that there was an entire ecosystem functioning silently around your work. It wasn't just oil. It was an infrastructure of invisibility. There were brokers in Oman who bought the oil without asking questions and resold it to refineries in Asia with documentation that no one would audit. There were lawyers in Malta and the Marshall Islands creating layers of companies, each ship belonging to a company that belonged to another, that belonged to an address in Luxembourg that didn't actually exist. There were captains who knew exactly what they were transporting and never mentioned it, not even to themselves. And there were port inspectors in 3 different countries receiving monthly payments for their silence, regardless of any specific operation. You learned that the Strait of Hormuz was not the main obstacle. The main obstacle was consistency. 1 operation could go through, 2 could go through. What brought down networks like that was the pattern. It was the moment when someone cross-referenced data from a deactivated AIS with patterns of refueling, ship positioning, transfers within specific time windows, and saw something that shouldn't exist. You became obsessed with not creating patterns. Each route is different from the previous one. Each support port rotates in a cycle. Each interval between operations is calculated to avoid coinciding with patrol schedules. It was during this time that you met Tariq, Iraqi. He had studied in London. He spoke 4 languages and had the unsettling habit of never looking at the horizon, always at the exits. When you first met in a cafe in downtown Dubai, he arrived 15 minutes early and was sitting with his back to the wall, facing the door, when you walked in. Did you notice that? He noticed that you noticed. Old habit, he said, without you having asked anything. Tariq was the link between his side of the operation, logistics, and the end buyers in Asia. And he said something in that first meeting that stayed with you for years. In this business, mistakes rarely come from outside. They come when someone starts to feel secure. You thought you understood. It wasn't there yet. 3 weeks later, one of the ships was intercepted. It wasn't a ship you had coordinated. It belonged to another arm of the operation. A different route, a different captain. But it was part of the same network. And when the news arrived, you stood frozen in the middle of the apartment for a moment. The kind of paralysis that lasts only 2 or 3 seconds but feels much longer inside. Then you sat down. You breathed. And he spent the next hour coldly checking if there was any trace connecting that ship to you. There was one. Small, but it existed. The trace was a series of communications via an encrypted radio system that had passed through a relay you had configured in a previous operation. Technically, there was nothing that connected you directly, but for those who knew what they were looking at, and there were people who did, the pattern was visible. You had 48 hours. You could have disappeared. You had enough money. You had enough passports. You had thought about that possibility before, in an abstract way, the way people think about emergency plans they hope they never need to use. But leaving at that moment, without coordination, without notifying the staff, That would be as clear a signal as any physical evidence. And there were people in that network who wouldn't tolerate signs of that kind. So you did the opposite. You went to Tariq. Do you remember his, expression when you started explaining? He didn't interrupt. He didn't show surprise. He just listened, with that characteristic stillness, like someone who had already calculated 20 possible outcomes before you finished the first sentence. When you finished, the silence lasted longer than was comfortable. Do you know what you just did? He asked. You said you knew. No, he said. Not completely. The relay was deactivated that night. The sequence of communications was deleted from accessible servers. And in the investigation that followed, weeks, multiple intelligence agencies, at least one analyst you never met, but who came dangerously close to putting the right pieces of the puzzle together, nothing ever reached you. But something was different now. Tariq had reported the incident to his superiors, and the people above wanted to meet you. What you didn't know was that the analyst in Bahrain, the same one who had noticed the AIS anomaly months earlier, had just reopened that file. This time he wasn't alone. The meeting took place on a yacht anchored off Fujairah. There were 3 men you didn't know, and the complete absence of formal introductions was, in itself, a message. They already knew who you were. They needed to know if you were who you appeared to be. The conversation lasted 2 hours. They asked questions about logistics, routes, blind spots for American naval patrols in the Gulf, and how the communication window between destroyers and surveillance drones worked. These weren't test questions. They were questions from people who needed real answers. You answered them. Finally, one of them placed a file on the table. You read it. 4 ships, simultaneous routes, coordinated crossing windows to create tracking noise. When 4 ships turn off their AIS at the same time at different points, the warning signal is diluted. An operation that someone had planned competently, but which had 3 points of failure that you identified in the first 20 minutes. They wanted you to coordinate everything. The total value of the cargo exceeded $300 million. You requested 72 hours. They said 48. You spent 40 hours rebuilding the operation, identifying the points of failure, proposing changes to 2 of the routes, replacing one of the support ports with an alternative that you had identified months before and had never used, unconsciously saving it for a moment exactly like that. There was a moment. It was 2 in the morning, in the apartment with the maps on the screen and the calculations on the table. When you stopped, he stood gazing at what he had built, and he had the clear, unpleasant feeling that he was very good at it, not as a compliment, as a warning. When he returned with the modifications, the silence in the room was different. The operation lasted 18 days. All 4 ships arrived. All the cargo was delivered, and you woke up the next morning with a different account number than it was when you went to sleep. It was the most powerful moment you had ever felt. You should have realized that it was also the moment when you had become impossible to ignore, from all sides. If you've made it this far, leave a like now. Most people don't understand what's happening in this story yet, but you do, and the worst is yet to come. When you move up within a structure like that, you don't receive a title. There is no meeting. There is no contract. What happens is more subtle and more permanent. People will start calling you directly. Not for Tariq, not for Nikos, for you. And each connection is an invisible obligation that accumulates without you realizing its weight. Just as you don't realize when a backpack gets too heavy, you only notice when you try to take it off. You started being consulted on operations you weren't coordinating. Your approval, even informal, even veiled, began to carry weight. And when you opined that a route was bad, the route changed. When you said a captain was a risk, the captain disappeared from the list. You didn't realize when you stopped being a service provider and became part of the decision-making structure, but others noticed. There was a man named Vasilis, a Greek Cypriot who operated one of the fleets of ghost ships used by the network. A decade building that fleet, a decade being the person no one could get past. You had unintentionally changed that, not out of malice, out of competence. For Vasilis, the difference was irrelevant. You started noticing small things. Information arriving with inexplicable delays. Captains reporting problems to him before informing you. A meeting in Oman that you only found out about 48 hours later, by chance, in a conversation Tariq had and then mentioned in passing. Perhaps unintentionally, perhaps not. Vasilis was building something. You didn't know what yet. And then the message arrived. Not from Vasilis, from someone far superior to him. There was a problem with one of the buyers in Asia. A shipment had been delivered with incorrect specifications. The grade of oil did not match what had been negotiated. The loss amounted to $17 million, and the name that was being circulated as being responsible was his. You held your phone in your hand for a long moment after reading the message. Somewhere in the Persian Gulf, the analyst in Bahrain had just received a new report, and this time, there was a name in the file. Yours. You knew you hadn't made that mistake. He knew exactly who had committed the crime, and he also knew that proving this within a framework where evidence wasn't presented in court, it was evaluated in 10-minute conversations in windowless rooms, was a completely different exercise from any notion of justice you had learned. There were two visible options: accept responsibility and survive the episode with a damaged reputation, but a body intact, or point the finger at Vasilis, directly, from within the structure, and wait to see who the people above believed more. You chose a third option that no one was expecting. You brought the documentation. In 3 years of operating that network, you had preserved something that none of your colleagues had preserved, because all of them, shaped by a culture of invisibility, instinctively destroyed records. You had kept the specification records for each shipment you had coordinated, encrypted, on servers that nobody on the network knew about, not through strategic planning, out of professional habit. He was the type of person who didn't throw away tools. When the documents were presented, it became clear within minutes that the error had occurred in a shipment that had passed exclusively through the Vasilis supply chain. The silence that followed lasted more than comfortably. Vasilis tried to argue. There wasn't much to argue about. A week later, he was no longer part of the structure. You never knew the details, and you learned not to ask. But what happened next was something you hadn't anticipated. The organization had invested too much in you to let you go. It wasn't admiration. It was operational dependency. You knew too much. You understood too much. There was too much depth to your presence for your departure to be clean. And for the first time, you understood that the rise you had built was also the construction of your own prison. That same week, the analyst in Bahrain had been promoted. He was being transferred to a specific team, a unit dedicated to tracking sanctions evasion networks in the Persian Gulf. Your first task? To compile a dossier on an unidentified logistics coordinator who appeared in increasingly different and never directly traceable ways in at least 6 operations over the past 3 years. He opened the file. He posted his photo, taken from a port's security camera, blurry, almost useless, and he wrote at the top, "Subject unknown. In progress." You continued operating for another 18 months after. Understanding this, not because I needed the money, because leaving a structure like that wasn't a conversation. It wasn't a termination. It was a negotiation that needed to be conducted with the same precision as any other operation, with calculated exit routes, prepared coverage, a narrative that satisfied the structure enough for it to prefer letting you leave rather than keeping you reluctantly inside. People who are upset make mistakes. Disgruntled people speak up. A structure that functioned through silence knew how to calculate this. You started to become less indispensable. Deliberately, he transferred knowledge. He documented processes that previously existed only in his head. He recommended people for roles that had been exclusively his. He created redundancy, not out of altruism, but because a replaceable cog can be dispensed with. An irreplaceable cog remains stuck forever. It took 2 years. During those 2 years, you knew, through side channels, veiled conversations, a phrase Tariq said at a dinner in Dubai that he didn't immediately elaborate on, that someone was getting close. Not the network. Someone from the outside. You never confirmed who you were. You never wanted to know precisely. But there was a growing feeling, not of paranoia but of mathematics, that the window was closing. When he left, there was no drama involved. One last meeting, one last transfer, an undocumented agreement that both parties preferred to honor, rather than question. You crossed the Strait of Hormuz for the last time on a commercial flight, with legitimate documents, in a first-class seat that you paid for in cash. He looked out the window at that strip of water down below. 21 kilometers. You had crossed that distance more than 40 times in ways that should never have existed. He had built something within a world that doesn't exist on any map, doesn't answer to any law, and keeps no records of anyone. Somewhere down there, in an office, in Bahrain or perhaps somewhere else, there was a man with a file bearing his name, a file that would never be complete enough to be used, but it would also never be closed. And the price had not been freedom. It hadn't been about the money. It had been something more difficult to name. It was the version of you that believed things had a fixed nature, that honest was honest, that illegal was illegal, that there was a clear line between the system and what was outside of it. This version had died in an apartment in Sharjah one afternoon when you looked at a bag with money inside and couldn't decide whose it was. The man who stepped off that plane knew how to construct invisible routes, buy the silence of people who seemed priceless, and disappear into the middle of the most heavily monitored ocean in the world. But she no longer knew how to look at herself in the mirror without calculating what was being observed. This is the part that nobody talks about. The money runs out. Contracts end. The operations are over. What never ends is what you've become in order to survive within them. And the file, the archive never ends. At what point do you think he crossed the point of no return? Was it when he accepted the offer? When he kept the first records? When he went to Tariq instead of running away? Or when he realized he knew too much to leave? Answer in the comments. If this story captivated you from beginning to end, subscribe to the channel. Every week, you'll experience a life that most people will never know. And if you want to enter an even more closed-off, even more dangerous world, and one that's even harder to escape, click on the video that's appearing on the screen right now. The next story begins where this one never dared to go.